Have you ever looked someone straight in the eyes and wondered, what are they really thinking? Not what they're saying, not what they're pretending, not the carefully crafted words they've chosen for you to hear. I'm talking about their real intentions. Because here's a truth most people learn far too late. The greatest opportunities you'll ever find, and the greatest dangers you'll ever face, will come disguised as people. A business partner who says all the right things, a friend who smiles while hiding resentment, a salesperson who sounds trustworthy, a leader who promises certainty, a stranger who appears harmless. The question is, how do you know what's real? How do you see past the performance and into the person? Most people spend years trying to understand human behavior. They listen to words, watch actions, and trust instincts that are often wrong. But what if there was a faster way? What if, within minutes, you could begin uncovering someone's true motivations? What if you could recognize hidden agendas, detect genuine interest, spot manipulation, and understand what drives people beneath the surface? Because the people who succeed at the highest levels of business, leadership, negotiation, and relationships don't possess some magical gift. They simply know where to look. They understand that every human being leaves clues, tiny signals, invisible patterns, behavioral fingerprints. And once you learn to recognize those patterns, you'll never see conversations the same way again. Today, you're going to discover the fastest way to read someone's true intentions. Not through mind reading, not through guesswork, but through understanding the hidden language that people reveal every single day without realizing it. And once you learn it, you'll start seeing what others miss. Let's begin. Have you ever noticed that some people don't leave during the biggest argument? They don't walk away when voices are raised. They don't disappear after one bad day, one misunderstanding, or one mistake. In fact, some of the most emotionally aware people you'll ever meet have an incredible capacity for patience. They can absorb stress, understand different perspectives, and forgive things that would push most people away immediately. That's what makes this so dangerous. People assume that because these individuals stay, because they continue listening, because they continue caring, everything must be fine. But beneath the surface, something very different is happening. One of the fastest ways to lose an empath forever is to repeatedly ignore their feelings. Not once, not twice. Not because you're having a bad day. Everyone makes mistakes. Everyone gets distracted. Everyone occasionally fails to understand another person's emotional experience. That's not what causes the damage. The damage begins when dismissal becomes a pattern. When every concern they bring up is treated as an overreaction. When every emotion they express is met with criticism instead of curiosity. When every attempt at connection is met with indifference instead of understanding. The interesting thing about emotionally intelligent people is that they don't expect perfection. They know human beings are flawed. They know relationships are messy. They know communication isn't always clean and clear. What they hope for is something much simpler. They hope to feel heard. They hope to feel understood. They hope to know that their emotions matter to the people they care about. And when that basic need goes unmet over and over again, a silent process begins. At first, they explain themselves. They try to communicate. They tell you what hurt them. They tell you why something bothered them. They give you context. They help you understand their perspective. They don't do this to create conflict. They do it because they believe the relationship is worth protecting. They believe that if both people understand each other better, the connection can become stronger. That's why they invest so much effort into those conversations. But imagine what happens when every conversation ends the same way. Imagine opening up about something important and hearing, "You're too sensitive." Imagine expressing disappointment and being told, "You're making a big deal out of nothing." Imagine sharing your feelings and watching someone roll their eyes, change the subject, laugh it off, or turn the conversation back onto themselves. At first, it feels frustrating. Then it feels disappointing. Eventually, it starts feeling pointless. And that's the moment most people miss. Because the empath doesn't suddenly stop caring. They stop believing that caring will make a difference. There is a massive difference between those two things. When someone argues with you, they are still invested. When someone tries to explain themselves repeatedly, they are still invested. When someone continues fighting for understanding, they are still invested. The danger isn't when they become emotional. The danger is when they become quiet. Silence is often misunderstood. Most people think silence means peace. They think fewer complaints mean fewer problems. They assume that because the difficult conversations have stopped, everything has improved. But sometimes silence is not the absence of pain. Sometimes silence is the acceptance that speaking no longer matters. The empath begins observing instead of explaining. They start paying attention to patterns. They notice how quickly you dismiss their concerns. They notice how often their emotional needs are treated as inconveniences. They notice how much effort they invest compared to what they receive. And with every observation, another layer of emotional attachment begins to dissolve. The fascinating thing is that this process is rarely dramatic. There are no announcements, no threats, no countdowns, no grand speeches. The person who once fought desperately to be understood gradually becomes someone who simply watches. While everyone else believes the relationship is continuing normally, they're conducting a quiet evaluation. They're asking themselves difficult questions. Why am I constantly explaining the same thing? Why do I feel alone even when I'm with this person? Why do my emotions seem valuable to everyone except the people closest to me? Why am I giving understanding that I never receive in return? These questions don't appear overnight. They accumulate slowly. One dismissal becomes 10. 10 becomes 50. 50 becomes a pattern that can no longer be ignored. And here's what makes emotionally aware people different from many others. They don't usually leave because of a single event. They leave because of accumulated evidence. Each ignored feeling becomes a piece of data. Each dismissive response becomes a piece of data. Each moment of emotional neglect becomes a piece of data. Over time, those pieces form a picture that becomes impossible to unsee. Eventually, they realize something painful. The relationship isn't hurting because they're expressing feelings. The relationship is hurting because their feelings are consistently being treated as unimportant. That realization changes everything. Because once someone understands the source of their pain, they stop searching for solutions in the wrong places. They stop blaming themselves. They stop wondering if they're asking for too much. They stop questioning whether their emotions are valid, and they begin protecting themselves instead. The shift is subtle, but it's powerful. They share less, they reveal less, they invest less. The emotional energy that once flowed naturally toward the relationship begins flowing inward. They're no longer trying to convince someone to understand them. They're trying to understand why they've tolerated being misunderstood for so long. Most people never recognize this transition while it's happening. They assume the empath is becoming easier to deal with, more relaxed, less emotional, less demanding. But what they're actually witnessing is emotional detachment. The person hasn't become less sensitive. They've become less available. And that's a very different thing. By the time the relationship finally ends, outsiders are often shocked. They ask questions like, "Why didn't you say anything?" The truth is they did, again and again. In conversations, in explanations, in vulnerable moments, in honest attempts to create understanding. The warnings were never hidden. They were simply ignored. What surprises people is not the departure itself. What surprises them is how calm it looks. Because once an empath reaches that point, the decision has often been made long before the actual exit. The emotional goodbye happened months earlier. The trust eroded gradually. The connection weakened quietly. The attachment faded piece by piece. And when they finally walk away, they aren't acting impulsively. They're acting on a conclusion they've been building for a very long time. That's why their departure often feels so final. It's not driven by anger. It's not fueled by revenge. It's not motivated by a desire to punish anyone. It's the result of recognizing that no matter how deeply they care, no relationship can survive when one person's feelings are repeatedly treated as though they don't matter. And once someone reaches the point where they truly believe their emotions will never be respected, understood, or valued, they stop trying to force a connection that only exists on one side. They choose peace over frustration, distance over disappointment, and silence over another conversation that leads nowhere. Then one day, without drama, without conflict, and without warning, they're gone. There is something remarkable about people who naturally give more than they take. You can spot them in almost every environment. They're the ones who answer the late night phone calls. They're the ones who listen when everyone else is tired of listening. They're the ones who remember the details, notice when something feels off, and check in when nobody else does. They make people feel understood. They make people feel important. They make people feel seen. And because they do this so naturally, many people begin to assume that this endless supply of care, attention, and emotional energy will always be available. That's where the problem begins. The people who give the most are often the people others appreciate the least. Not because they're unimportant, but because their support becomes expected. Human beings have a strange tendency to stop noticing things that are consistently present. The same way you stop noticing the sound of a clock after a while, some people stop noticing the emotional effort being made on their behalf. The empathy becomes invisible. The patience becomes invisible. The sacrifices become invisible. An empath rarely enters a relationship asking, "What can I get from this person?" Their instinct is usually the opposite. They wonder how they can help, how they can support, how they can make life easier for someone they care about. They invest emotionally because that's who they are. They listen because they genuinely want to understand. They give because seeing others happy brings them satisfaction. But here's something many people fail to understand. Even the most generous heart has limits. Even the strongest emotional support system requires support. Even the person who carries everyone else eventually becomes exhausted. The mistake people make is assuming that, because an empath doesn't complain, they aren't affected. Because they continue showing up, people assume they're fine. Because they continue helping, people assume they have unlimited energy. But emotional exhaustion doesn't always announce itself. It builds quietly. Think about what happens when one person becomes the emotional caretaker in every interaction. Every problem gets brought to them. Every crisis lands on their shoulders. Every difficult conversation requires their patience. Every misunderstanding requires their understanding. Every conflict requires their forgiveness. Meanwhile, when they need support, the room suddenly becomes empty. At first, they don't notice it. Or maybe they notice it but make excuses for it. They tell themselves that people are busy. They tell themselves that everyone is dealing with their own struggles. They tell themselves that things will balance out eventually. Because people who care deeply often extend endless grace to others. They understand weakness. They understand mistakes. They understand imperfection. But understanding someone's behavior doesn't eliminate the impact of it. Over time, something begins to feel different. The empath starts noticing that every conversation revolves around someone else's needs. They notice they're always the listener and rarely the one being heard. They notice they're always giving advice but rarely receiving support. They notice they're expected to understand everyone else's emotions while nobody seems interested in understanding theirs. This realization rarely arrives all at once. It's a gradual accumulation of moments. A text message that goes unanswered. A problem they shared that nobody followed up on. A difficult day that nobody asked about. A sacrifice that went unnoticed. A kindness that became expected instead of appreciated. Each moment seems small by itself, almost insignificant. But relationships are not built on single moments. They're built on patterns. And patterns reveal truths that isolated events cannot. One of the most painful discoveries an empath can make is realizing that people value what they provide more than who they are. Think about that for a moment. People call when they need advice. People reach out when they need comfort. People seek them out when life becomes difficult. But when everything is fine, the connection disappears. The relationship becomes transactional. Not because anyone intentionally designed it that way, but because it slowly evolved into an arrangement where one person gives and the other receives. And the longer that arrangement continues, the more damaging it becomes. Because giving without receiving creates imbalance, and imbalance creates resentment. Not the loud kind of resentment that explodes into arguments. The quiet kind. The dangerous kind. The kind that grows beneath the surface while everyone else assumes everything is normal. The empath begins asking questions they never asked before. Would this person be here for me the way I've been here for them? Would they sacrifice for me the way I've sacrificed for them? Would they listen to me the way I've listened to them? Would they show up if I needed them? These questions aren't born from selfishness. They're born from awareness. Because eventually every emotionally intelligent person reaches a point where they evaluate the health of their relationships. And when they do, they stop looking at words. They start looking at actions. Actions tell the truth. Actions reveal priorities. Actions expose the difference between appreciation and dependence. Many people think they love the empath in their life. But sometimes what they actually love is access to the empath's energy. They love having someone who understands them, someone who forgives them, someone who supports them, someone who remains patient with them. And when those benefits disappear, the relationship suddenly changes. The empath notices this more than anyone realizes. They notice who checks in only when they need something. They notice who disappears during difficult times. They notice who receives support effortlessly, but struggles to offer support in return. Because emotionally aware people pay attention to patterns of investment, not just affection. Investment. Where does the time go? Where does the effort go? Where does the energy go? Eventually, the empath realizes they're carrying a relationship that requires two people. And that's when everything starts changing. Not outwardly, not immediately, internally. They stop volunteering their energy so freely. They stop rushing to solve everyone's problems. They stop rescuing people who never learned to stand on their own. They stop sacrificing themselves to maintain connections that aren't being maintained by both sides. The interesting thing is that most people don't recognize this shift when it begins. They only notice the results. Suddenly the empath isn't available every time they call. Suddenly the empath isn't solving every crisis. Suddenly the empath isn't giving endless emotional resources without question. And people become confused. They wonder what happened. What happened is simple. The empath finally measured what they were giving against what they were receiving. And for the first time, they stopped ignoring the difference. That doesn't mean they become cold. It doesn't mean they stop caring. It doesn't mean they become selfish. It means they become selective. There's a difference. A massive difference. They learn that caring for others should not require abandoning themselves. They learn that generosity should not demand self-destruction. They learn that healthy relationships involve mutual investment, mutual effort, mutual support, mutual care. And when those things are absent long enough, they begin detaching from the relationship emotionally. Not because they want to, because they have to. Because no human being can continuously pour from an empty cup. No matter how compassionate they are, no matter how patient they are, no matter how deeply they care, eventually survival takes priority over sacrifice. And once an empath reaches that realization, something profound happens. They stop chasing people. They stop overextending themselves. They stop proving their worth through endless giving. Instead, they direct that energy toward protecting their own peace, toward relationships that feel balanced, toward people who reciprocate effort, toward connections where support flows both ways. And when they finally step away from those one-sided relationships, they rarely make a scene. They rarely seek revenge. They rarely demand recognition. They simply withdraw the energy that was holding everything together. And that's when people discover something they never expected. The relationship wasn't surviving because both people were carrying it. It was surviving because one person had been carrying it all along. Trust is one of the most misunderstood forces in human relationships. Most people think trust is built through time. They believe that if enough months pass, if enough conversations happen, if enough memories are created, trust naturally appears. But that's not entirely true. Time doesn't create trust. Consistency creates trust. Honesty creates trust. Reliability creates trust. The feeling that someone's words and actions align creates trust. And for an empath, trust is not just another part of a relationship. It is the foundation that supports everything else. When an empath lets someone into their life, they're not simply sharing information. They're sharing access. Access to their thoughts, their fears, their dreams, their insecurities, their struggles. and the parts of themselves they don't reveal to the rest of the world. While many people protect those areas with walls, empaths often choose connection over protection. They believe in seeing the good in people. They believe in giving chances. They believe in understanding imperfections. They don't enter relationships expecting betrayal. They enter hoping for authenticity. That hope is powerful. It allows them to connect deeply. It allows them to build meaningful relationships. It allows them to create bonds that many people spend a lifetime searching for. But the very thing that makes those connections so strong is also what makes betrayal so devastating. Because when trust is broken, an empath doesn't just lose confidence in a person. They lose confidence in the emotional safety they believed existed. And emotional safety is everything. Think about it for a moment. People can survive disagreements. They can survive misunderstandings. They can survive mistakes. But once they stop feeling safe, the relationship changes completely. The conversation may continue. The communication may continue. The interaction may continue. But something essential has been damaged. Something invisible. Something difficult to repair. The empath begins questioning things they never questioned before. Were those words genuine? Were those promises real? Was that kindness authentic? Was that support sincere? Or was I seeing what I wanted to see? The moment those questions appear, the relationship enters dangerous territory. Because trust allows people to relax. Trust allows vulnerability. Trust allows openness. Without trust, every interaction becomes filtered through uncertainty. Every statement is examined. Every action is evaluated. Every inconsistency becomes noticeable. And the person responsible for the betrayal often has no idea how much has changed. Many people assume betrayal only refers to dramatic events. A major lie, a broken promise, an act of infidelity, a public humiliation. Those things certainly qualify. But for an empath, betrayal often begins long before anything dramatic happens. Sometimes betrayal looks like sharing a private conversation with someone who was never supposed to hear it. Sometimes it looks like using someone's vulnerabilities against them during an argument. Sometimes it looks like presenting a false version of yourself to gain someone's trust. Sometimes it looks like repeated dishonesty about small things that gradually reveal a much larger pattern. The size of the betrayal matters less than what it communicates. And what betrayal communicates is this: I am not who you believed I was. That realization cuts deeper than many people understand. Because empaths invest heavily in their perception of others. They spend time understanding people, studying people, supporting people, believing in people. When betrayal occurs, it doesn't simply challenge a relationship, it challenges their judgment. And that's painful, not because they feel foolish, but because they trusted sincerely. They weren't playing games. They weren't calculating risks. They were being genuine. And discovering that someone took advantage of that sincerity creates a wound that lingers far beyond the original event. What's fascinating is that empaths rarely react immediately. Most people expect betrayal to trigger an explosion. Anger, confrontation, accusations. Sometimes it does. But more often, something quieter happens. The empath begins observing, very carefully. They stop focusing on what the person says. They start focusing on what the person does. Patterns become impossible to ignore. Inconsistencies become impossible to ignore. Contradictions become impossible to ignore. Because once trust has been broken, the mind naturally begins searching for evidence. Not because it wants to, because it has learned that appearances can be misleading. And the more evidence they find, the more difficult it becomes to restore what was lost. Many people believe trust can be repaired through apologies alone. They think the right words will solve the problem, the right explanation, the right emotional conversation, the right promise. But trust isn't rebuilt through words. Trust is rebuilt through proof. And proof requires time, consistent action, repeated demonstrations of honesty, a willingness to accept responsibility. Unfortunately, many people want forgiveness without accountability. They want the relationship restored without doing the work required to restore it. And empaths notice that immediately, because sincerity leaves clues. So does manipulation. One creates confidence. The other creates doubt. An empath can forgive a mistake. They can forgive human imperfection. What becomes difficult to forgive is a pattern of behavior that reveals a lack of integrity. especially when the person responsible refuses to acknowledge the damage they caused. That's when emotional distance begins forming. Slowly, quietly, almost invisibly, the empath starts protecting information, protecting vulnerability, protecting access. The same person who once shared everything now shares very little. Not because they became secretive, because they became cautious. Trust opened the door. Betrayal taught them to lock it. And here's what many people fail to recognize. When an empath withdraws trust, they aren't trying to punish anyone. They're trying to protect themselves. There's a profound difference between those two motivations. Punishment seeks revenge, protection seeks peace. The empath isn't thinking about how to hurt the other person. They're thinking about how to prevent further damage, how to avoid repeating the same experience, how to preserve their emotional well-being. The relationship may still appear normal from the outside. They may still be polite, respectful, kind. But internally, something has shifted. The emotional investment begins fading. The future they imagined with that person begins fading. The sense of security begins fading. And once that process starts, it becomes incredibly difficult to reverse. Because trust functions like a bridge. When it's strong, people cross it without hesitation. When it's damaged, every step feels uncertain. When it's destroyed, people stop crossing altogether. The most surprising part is that the final departure often seems sudden to everyone except the empath. Friends are confused. Family members are confused. Even the person responsible for the betrayal is often confused. They wonder why the empath left so completely. Why they didn't fight harder. Why they didn't stay longer. What they fail to understand is that the departure didn't begin on the day the relationship ended. It began on the day trust was broken. Everything afterward was simply the gradual realization that the damage wasn't temporary, that the foundation wasn't as strong as it appeared, that the person they believed in wasn't the person standing in front of them. And once that realization becomes undeniable, the empath makes a choice. Not out of anger, not out of bitterness, not out of revenge, but out of self-respect. Because they understand something many people spend years learning. A relationship without trust is not a relationship. It's an uncertainty. It's a question mark. It's a constant negotiation between hope and doubt. And eventually, there comes a moment when protecting their peace becomes more important than preserving a connection that no longer feels safe. When that moment arrives, they don't usually announce it. They don't create drama. They don't seek validation. They simply stop investing in a future that no longer feels secure and quietly walk toward one that does. So, what have we learned? An empath rarely disappears because of a single argument. They rarely leave because of one bad day. And they almost never walk away without giving chances. They leave after their feelings have been repeatedly ignored. They leave after giving more than they receive for far too long. And they leave after trust has been broken one too many times. That's the part most people never understand. They think the departure happened in a moment. But the truth is, it happened slowly, quietly, one disappointment at a time, one dismissal at a time, one betrayal at a time. Long before the empath physically leaves, they've already been carrying the weight of a difficult decision. They've already spent countless nights questioning themselves, making excuses for others, hoping things would improve, and convincing themselves to stay just a little longer. Because empaths don't give up easily. They don't throw people away. They don't abandon connections without reason. In fact, they often stay longer than they should because they believe in the good they see in others. But eventually, a powerful realization takes place. They understand that compassion does not require self-sacrifice. They understand that loyalty should not require suffering. And they understand that protecting their peace is not selfish. It's necessary. The moment they reach that understanding, everything changes. Not because they stop caring, but because they finally start caring about themselves too. And here's the question I want you to think about. Are the people closest to you feeling heard? Are they feeling valued? Are they feeling appreciated? Or have you become so comfortable with their presence that you've stopped noticing everything they quietly do for you? Because the people who care the deepest often complain the least. The people who support everyone else often suffer in silence. And the people who seem strongest on the outside are sometimes carrying burdens nobody can see. Never assume someone's loyalty means they'll stay forever. Never assume someone's kindness means they'll tolerate anything. And never assume that because someone is still there today, they'll always be there tomorrow. Value people while you have them. Listen when they speak. Appreciate what they give. Protect the trust they place in you. Because one day, the person who always understood you, supported you, forgave you, and stood beside you may decide they've given enough. And when an empath truly reaches that point, they don't usually slam doors. They don't make speeches. They don't seek revenge. They simply become a memory, a lesson, a chapter that quietly closes. And by the time you realize they're gone, you may discover that the silence they left behind says more than words ever could.